I'm very excited to be able to share my work today, and thank you, Leah, for the warm introduction. I'll be sharing work that I have completed as part of my comprehensive examination process for my PhD. And as Leah mentioned, the work that we're presenting today is currently under review for publication. I'll begin today just walking everyone through our research question and key findings that emerged. From there, I'm going to discuss what these findings mean for school-based occupational therapy practice and highlight key implications for clinical work. I'll wrap up with several considerations for future direction. And then following the formal presentation, I'm really hoping that we'll have time for some rich discussion to hear about other people's experiences on this topic and any other reflections they have and needs related to this topic. So why does this topic matter? So when we look at the evidence around P4C research, one area that has not been studied today is the co-delivery of P4C by OTs and OTAs. And in addition, within the broader body of literature that's on tiered models of service delivery, OT roles remain a limited focus, and there's not a lot of evidence at this point in time. So by identifying the specific activities that OTs and OTAs engage in at each service tier, it can help us to understand how these professionals across the two roles collaborate together within a tiered model. So in addition, understanding clear delegation and defined roles and responsibilities that are guided by national competencies for OTs practicing in Canada, in addition to provincial and territorial regulatory bodies, is important to help us better understand how to deliver services effectively. So I just wanted to pull up the Partnering for Change model just to talk about it a little bit in the context of our research question as we move forward. So as most people on the call probably know, P4C is a collaborative tiered model for OT services in school settings. And the diagram on the right is really showing the different services leveled across tiers as services become more individualized. So at the base of the triangle, we're seeing universal services for all students. And then services become more intensive up to the top of the triangle where they're individualized for students. And I think what's important as we're starting to think about the different services is that as services become more intensive, clinicians are required to engage in decision making and to be assessing and monitoring how students are responding to interventions to identify if a different level of service is required to holistically meet the needs of a student. So the research question that we have focused on or emerged from data that was collected from a larger P4C implementation study that was underway. And what we wanted to understand was what are the environmental factors, skills, and occupations addressed in each tier, so 1, 2, and 3 of the P4C model by OTs and OTAs in the first 2 years of implementation. So to examine that question, I drew on the data from the original P4C implementation study. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that study. So between 2022 and 2024, the P4C team conducted a realist evaluation study, which used case study methodology to test their theory of how P4C works in practice. So they tracked 10 schools in Ontario over the first 2 years of implementation and used multiple methods and gathered different types of data. So on the right-hand side, I'm showing the different types of data that were collected in this broader study. So they collected interview data with educators, clinicians, families, and administrators. They collected reflective journals and service logs that were completed by OTs and OTAs. And they conducted surveys of educators, families, and clinicians, and reviewed reports of waitlist data from those organizations. So the study what we looked at really was focusing on the service logs that were completed by OTs and OTAs. So I'm going to just show you what the service log, a very small snippet of what the service logs look like. So each day OTs and OTAs were in schools providing services. They were asked to complete a service log to document their focus of service delivery. And the service logs were, clinicians completed them in a survey format. So I'm showing you it in a paper format, but I'm just going to, hopefully that comes up and everyone can see that. So I'm just showing you, they would have had some other questions in advance of this that would have asked them to identify what tier of service they were providing. So for example, maybe this would be tier 1. And then once they'd identified the tier level, they were then asked to select whether that service was provided, address self-care, productivity, leisure, or environmental factors. And then once they selected one of those, they would have been given an option for more drop-down menus. So for example, if I did self-care at tier 1, then I would have the choice of snack, clothing management, behavior, backpack, social emotional well-being. So as you can see, it was drop-down menus, so OTs and OTAs were somewhat limited with the options that they could choose. However, in all the categories, there was an other option, and with that other option, there was an open text box for them to be able to write in what they addressed that was different from what was already in the drop-down menus. So what did we do? So to answer our question, we performed a secondary analysis of P4C of the P4C research data, which means that we used the service log data that was collected from this larger study in Ontario between those 2 years to answer our question. So the service logs, when they came to me for analysis, were already anonymized, and the school demographic information that we used was gathered from publicly available sources. And the surveys were in the form of questionnaires, like I had just shown you, which were a series of closed-ended questions asking therapists to identify the focus of services. So first by tier, then by skill, occupation, and environmental factors. So because this was a secondary analysis, we then had to kind of think about what would be the best way to analyze and examine the data that we have. So next, I'm just going to walk you through our process of analysis that we used to address this question. Just going to take a quick drink of water. So in this study, we really wanted to look at how often OTs and OTAs addressed occupation, skills, and environmental factors in their interventions, as was documented in the surveys. So to do this, we used a statistical method designed for yes-no data to estimate the probability that these skills or occupations were addressed. We also examined whether there were patterns in differences across service tiers, so 1, 2, or 3, and whether there was differences in roles between OTs and OTAs. So just to give you an example, we wanted to look at what we analyzed was, did OTs address toileting? I'm going to use that as the example, yes or no. Did OTAs address toileting? Yes or no. And then we compared what were the similarities and differences across tiers and what were the similarity and differences across the two roles. So overall, we reviewed 527 service logs from 9 schools that were collected over a 2-year period. And I'm just going to go into in the next slide a little bit about what we found. So initially, we looked at year 1 and year 2 data separately, and the data between the 2 years was almost exactly identical. There were no significant differences between the 2 years. So what we decided to do was combine, so aggregate all the data together to look at an overall pattern of implementation. And what we found was, of the 9 schools involved, that they were all K-8 schools, there was an even distribution across urban, rural, and mixed areas. But student populations range from 55 to 615 students, and that 10 to 30% of the student population was receiving special education support. And the provincial average for this time frame was about 16%, and we gathered that information from the EQAO reporting from 2023 and 2024. In terms of the participants, we had 10 OTAs that had between 1 to 24 years experience and 13 OTs with between 2 to 35 years experience. And I'm going to, over the next series of slides, start to kind of get into the results relating to the focus of services. So I'm going to take some time on this slide just to orient everyone to what's on the slides because they can be quite busy slides with lots going on in them. So this slide here is going to show you the focus of OT services. So looking at the skills and occupations. So along the bottom axis, you're going to see the different skills across occupational categories. So self-care, productivity, and leisure. And along the side axis, the y-axis, you're going to see percentage, so the probability. So what we're looking at is what is the probability that an OT would address a skill or occupation within a category. What we also did, so I'm going to kind of reveal the self-care and leisure results, and then you're also going to see the tiers. So tiers are represented by shapes and colors. So tier 1 is represented by a red circle, tier 2 is represented by a green triangle, and tier 3 is represented by a blue square. So in this diagram, what we're looking at is the OT focus of service and self-care and leisure across the three tiers. So what we see is there was never a zero probability. So every skill was addressed across all three tiers in both self-care and leisure. The greatest probabilities of focus for OTs in self-care and leisure tended to be at tier 3. And the probabilities in tier 1 and tier 2 in both those categories were also much lower. They were probably between 2 and 10% across the other self-care and leisure categories in tier 1 and tier 2. The highest probabilities of focus were in the area of productivity and specifically around printing and cursive writing, where we're seeing the highest probabilities at tier 2, which fell just below 75%, and followed by tier 1, which was just above 50%, followed by tier 3, which was just below 50%. It was also high overall. The probabilities were, for the most part, overall higher in the productivity skills. The next highest area was tool use, which is probably somewhat aligned with what we're seeing with handwriting and cursive, because those two things are probably somewhat connected. So I'm just going to go over to the next slide. So the next slide we're going to look at figure is very similar. So just to remind everyone, we're seeing the skills on the bottom by 3 occupational categories and the probabilities on the y-axis on the side. So in terms of the focus of OTA service, so this is focusing on OTA services. When we look at self-care and leisure, generally those two areas have lower probabilities, below 10% across all 3 tiers. Once again, nobody was zero. So some of them might have been around 1%, which meant that at some point in time, an OTA had provided a level of intervention in that area. And then the highest probabilities of OTAs providing services tended to be in the productivity category. Also similarly to OTs, in the printing and cursive writing area, similar to OTs, the highest probability was at tier 2, and that probability was also sitting at around just under 75%. What's different is with OTAs, the next highest category was tier 3, followed by tier 2. And then similar to OTs, tool use was also had higher probabilities across all 3 tiers as well. And then the next slide, it's going to be somewhat similar, but this one's looking at the environmental focus. So in our study, we captured environmental factors, really focusing on 3 things: classroom layout, ergonomics, and sensory changes. So the OT focus is on the left, the OTA focus is on the right. And what we're seeing for both OTs and OTAs is that the probabilities of providing changes around environmental factors happens at tier 3. OTs tend to provide higher probabilities across tier 1 and 2 than OTAs. The OTA ones are sitting kind of closer to 5% to 10% in most of those categories. So overall, the P4C model shows really that a tiered collaborative approach is helping OTs and OTAs to address not only productivity occupations, but also broader skills and self-care and leisure. And also that we're starting to see services being delivered, not just individualized at tier 3, but also a growth to providing services at tier 1 and tier 2. So over the next few slides, I want to just discuss some of the key takeaways from those findings, which we've grouped into 3 kind of themes or categories of understanding. So this first area is the idea of like broadening skills and occupations with room to grow. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, I think our findings are really showing a positive shift in focus to looking at services beyond supporting individual students to including provision of services that are more targeted and in small groups at tier 2 or universal to all students at tier 1. And the primary occupation of focus at this point does remain productivity. And for school-based OTs, and we were trying to kind of think about maybe some reasons, why are we kind of seeing that? And so some reasons that we've been thinking about are, first of all, in early grades, we know that literacy development and printing are foundational to academic success. And we also know that this is a really, historically, this is a really well-established area of school-based OT practice, and often an area where teachers are requesting support. Another reason that we were thinking could be a focus for clinicians was on around this idea around learning a new service model while also supporting areas where teachers are traditionally requesting help, and that the demands of implementing a new model may make it challenging to also expand the focus of service deliveries. So over time, I think we're hoping that the broadening of our focus and skills, the broadening of focus on skills and occupations alongside productivity to include self-care and leisure can support a more inclusive approach to participation. The next area that we kind of summarized our findings was this idea of expanding the environmental focus across tiers. So our study really focused on the physical elements that were being addressed and found that these elements were less commonly addressed at tier 1. So we were, you know, had higher probabilities of addressing them at tier 3. And we didn't include socialization under our environmental factor, but it was something that we captured under leisure. And I'm just bringing that up here because when you do some of the reading on the literature, socialization is often considered part of the environmental context. So even keeping that in mind, like even if we had put it under the environmental area, when you looked at the probability of addressing socialization, that was still less than 10% in our study across the 3 tiers. So we were thinking at really this finding that we're seeing around where we're focusing our intervention really highlights an important area of growth and opportunity for both researchers and clinicians to broaden how environmental contexts are understood. In particular, for research teams, they can begin to expand what they collect and how they analyze data related to the environment, focusing also on social and systematic environmental contexts. And in addition, there's a really large growing body of evidence to support student engagement and how this is really shaped by social relationships, which I think highlights the importance for clinicians to maybe broaden their conceptualizations of the environment beyond the physical. In addition, there's some really new literature coming out and neuroaffirming practice approaches to care that are consistently stressing the importance of the social environment and shaping overall students' interactions and participations. So these findings overall highlight for us an opportunity for clinicians to collaborate with educators to maybe be starting to think about when we're implementing strategies at tier 3, could those also be implemented at tier 1 to offer more universal support and potentially benefit all students? The final kind of theme or area I wanted to touch on was just this idea of the emerging roles of OTAs. So the OTA role in school-based OT practice is emerging, and research describing their specific roles remains limited. In our study, we found that OTAs addressed a broad range of skills, occupations, and environmental factors, and they were most likely to address productivity-related occupations across all tiers, with the greatest focus at tier 2. So we were trying to think about kind of some explanations for our findings. And some of the things that we had kind of thought about and discussed were that um, small group interventions create more opportunities for collaboration between OTs and OTAs. And this collaboration is really essential in models such as P4C, where clinical decision making, dynamically assessing students to monitor their response to intervention is essential to be able to identifying if different service supports are required. In addition, it may be that duties are more easily scripted in well-established areas. So productivity is a well-established area. So maybe that's why we can more easily delegate, particularly at tier 2. And finally, that within the primary study, many of the schools that were participating had wait lists, and implementing collaborative OTA and OT services at tier 2 may have been used as a strategy to support students who were already waiting for services. In this area, I think we're really hoping that ultimately our findings in this area encourage discussions about OTA scope of practice within P4C and how to strengthen their contributions and collaborations with OTs. So kind of where do we go from here, future next steps? There's kind of two areas I was thinking about. So this first one is really around exploring OT and OTA collaboration and delegation, and examining what collaboration looks like in practice and understanding how shared decision making works and the roles each professional assumes during service delivery. I can speak for myself. In my training, never really received training on what collaborative care with OTAs looks like. Didn't really receive training on how we do shared decision making together. I think that that's changing, and that's being embedded in practice. And hopefully, as newer students have preceptors also who are bringing this to them, that's helping. On the last slide, I'm going to talk here around this idea of working together. Teresa Avampado has done some excellent work, and she's an OT on OT and OTA collaboration. And I've on my next slide, I'm going to just share some resources with you. But she has some great modules that really I found helpful. I ask my students to do them. I think they find them helpful in how we work collaboratively together. So if anybody hasn't seen them, I'll put that on the last slide. I'd encourage people to read them. And I put an article in there on an environmental scan, which was a piece of work writing that she has done and research that has formed the foundation for her modules. The other area in terms of future practice is this idea of understanding clinical reasoning in school-based OT practice. So one of the things that we didn't look at in our study was we didn't really look at what were the factors that influenced how clinicians were determining the focus of their services. So understanding the clinical decision making and the clinical reasoning behind what was being targeted. So I just think that there is also opportunity for future research to start to think about what are the factors that influence what we decide to focus on. This kind of concludes the formal presentation part of my presentation today. I really want to thank everybody for attending today and for the flexibility with the weather last week and rescheduling. I really want to thank the P4C research team for their really ongoing guidance and support over the last year that I've been working on this work. And if anybody wants to connect with me, I put my email address up here. I'm an old McMaster grad, so it is my maiden name, which is why it's a different last name. And I've also put Dr. Campbell's contact information up here as well, if anybody would like to connect with her. And then the QR code is if you want to learn more about P4C, you can check out the QR code and their website. And then on the right-hand side is just some work that Teresa Avampado's done. So the top one is her publication, environmental scan, that looks at kind of how OTs are prepared for interprofessional practice. And then the bottom link is her modules, which are free for anybody to use. And I think that they're a really great resource for OTs and OTAs working together.